derivative test to find the x values that give the relative extrema for this. So, as the name implies, we're going to need first derivative. And to use the first derivative test, we need to find critical numbers. So critical numbers are numbers that make the first derivative 0 or undefined. This one's never undefined. Why?
Because it doesn't have a denominator.
Okay, well, even if it did, if it had a denominator of this, that would still be okay, right?
Yeah.
No x's on the denominator. But it certainly does equal 0. I would factor out a GCF personally, just to make it a little easier to solve. So it looks like this equals 0 at 0 and negative 3/2. Okay, and critical numbers are very likely to be places that is changing directions, and when your function's changing directions is where you're going to get relative extrema. So to know the shape and direction of our graph here, I need to test stuff around these. So we need to plug some number in between 0 and negative 3/2. Yeah.
I think it's positive 3/2 when you factor out negative 2x squared.
Oh.
It's 2x minus 3.
Thank you. Yeah, so be careful with your factoring. Okay, so instead of plugging in -1, maybe I should be plugging in +1 instead. So if I plug that in up here, -4 plus 6 is something positive, so I know the function's increasing. Plug in something over here, like maybe 2 or whatever, anything bigger than 3/2. Now this is, I don't think I've ever said this before, but just so you guys know that this is kind of a nice little tip, especially when you're doing questions without a calculator. Like plugging 2 into the first derivative here, I mean, it's not terrible, but you're trying to do -4 times 8 plus 6 times 4. The arithmetic is just a tiny bit harder. But if this is also the first derivative factored, sometimes it's easier to just plug it in down here, especially when you don't need to know the number and you just need to know if it's positive or negative. Because I've got something negative, plug in 2 times something positive, plug in 2 times something positive. Negative times a positive times a positive.
Negative. Oh, that's positive. Wait, no, it's negative, yeah.
Yeah, I was testing you.
That's close.
But I'm glad that you trust me more than yourself. Okay, plug in -1. I see it's negative times, this would be positive, because -1 squared would be positive. Plug in -1 here, it'd be negative. A negative times a positive times a negative would be positive. And so I know it's tempting to think that you're going to have relative extrema at every critical number, and that's true 90% of the time or more, but it's not guaranteed. So this going up and going up, I'd say there's not a relative extrema there, but increasing to decreasing, there is a relative extrema when x is 3/2. And okay, then it just depends on the directions. I said find the x values, so I don't have to find the point. So I would just say that would be the only relative extrema. Yeah. And it's a max, if you needed to know that. Okay, is that enough for 42? Anybody else that was going to ask about 42 need to ask something more detailed?